I first saw the portrait on a wet February afternoon, the kind of grey that seems to leach colour from the air. The rain had not stopped for days, and the archives of St. Cuthbert's University smelled of damp wool and floor polish. I was cataloguing a private donation from the estate of a long-dead photographer when I found it, wrapped in brittle tissue paper, the edges of the print scalloped like petals. I remember how my fingertips tingled when I lifted it from the box, though at the time I blamed static. The label on the reverse read simply, Weatherby Family, March 1920. It was an albumen print, mounted on card, the sort of formal studio portrait popular in the years after the Great War. A father in a three-piece suit stood beside a seated woman whose hair was pinned in the Gibson style, already fading from fashion. In her arms lay an infant, perhaps 6 months old, swaddled in white lace. Behind them hung a curtain of heavy damask, drawn so close that it devoured the background. The image was ordinary, even tender. Yet something about it unsettled me at once, a sense of too much stillness, as if the air around them had congealed. The mother's gaze struck me most, direct, unwavering, but not quite focused on the lens. She looked through it, or perhaps through me. I noted its dimensions, penciled its accession number, and filed it aside for cleaning. But all through the afternoon, the image tugged at my mind like a burr in cloth. When I locked up the darkroom that night, I found myself glancing back toward the table where it lay beneath its sheet of glassine, as if half expecting the curtain to stir. 2 days later, I began the restoration. The Weatherby print had fared better than most of its companions, only minor silvering and a faint tea stain at one corner. Under magnification, the details were exquisite. The weave of the mother's dress, the fine grain of the father's lapel. The baby's tiny hand, clenched near its chest, appeared to hold something small and round. At first, I thought it was a rattle, perhaps carved from bone. But when I angled the light, the object gleamed darkly, reflecting the studio lamps. It was metallic. I leaned closer. The shape was too regular for a toy, a perfect sphere no larger than a coin, with a fine seam running round its middle. I made a note to investigate the photographic props common in early 20th century portraiture. Still, the longer I studied that small shining orb, the less it resembled anything meant for a child. It looked, absurdly, like the casing of a bullet. I laughed aloud, a brittle sound in the silent lab, and forced myself to move on. But when I glanced again, the gleam had dulled, as though something within the photograph had swallowed the light. The Weatherby name yielded little in the census records. An Arthur Weatherby, solicitor, age 34 in 1920, his wife Eleanor, 28, and an infant daughter listed only as M. Weatherby. The family lived at a modest villa on the outskirts of Newark-on-Trent. No later entries. No death certificates either, merely an absence, a gap after 1921, as if they had stepped sideways out of history. Such disappearances were not uncommon in the aftermath of war. People moved, remarried, changed names. Yet something about that void troubled me. It was too absolute. When I told my colleague Daniel about it over tea, he smiled the indulgent smile he reserves for my eccentricities. "You're letting your imagination off the leash again," he said. "It's just a photograph." "Perhaps," I replied. "But there's a story in that silence." He shrugged. "Then write a paper about it." The sociological absence of minor gentry in post-war Nottinghamshire. We laughed, but the sound faltered before it reached the corners of the room. That night I dreamed of the portrait. I was back in the studio, or some memory of it, the air thick with flash powder. The father stood rigid, one hand gripping the back of the chair. The photographer counted down. "Hold still, please." The bulb ignited in a white bloom. In that instant, I saw movement, not from the parents, but from the infant. Its tiny fingers uncurled, revealing the black sphere, and the seam along its surface began to widen like an eyelid. I woke with my throat dry and my heart hammering. The clock read 3:17 a.m. My curtains, heavy velvet like those in the photo, shifted though the window was shut. By the following week, I could think of little else. I requested permission to research the Weatherby estate for contextual data. The archivist in Newark sent me a brittle envelope of parish documents. Among them was a baptism record dated April 4th, 1920. Mary Eleanor Weatherby, daughter of Arthur and Eleanor of Rose Hill. In the margin, the vicar had scrawled a note in faded ink. Baptized privately owing to delicate health of child. Another entry, dated 6 months later, chilled me. Burial, Mary Eleanor Weatherby, infant. Nothing extraordinary in that perhaps except for the date, October 30th, 1920. Barely half a year after the photograph was taken. A third document followed, a coroner's report. Cause of death, respiratory failure, consistent with asphyxiation. No external trauma. There was an addendum. Unexplained residue of metallic substance found on child's lips. I visited the old Weatherby property the next weekend. Rose Hill stood at the edge of a narrow lane lined with hawthorn. The house itself was a ruin of mellow brick and ivy, its windows boarded. Through a gap in the boards, I glimpsed the faint pattern of wallpaper, roses and ivy leaves, faded almost to ghostly outlines. A local man tending sheep nearby told me the place had been empty since the trouble, though he could not say what trouble. Some say the husband went balmy after the baby died, he said. Others say the wife ran off. But they never found her, did they? Found her? I repeated. He shrugged. Police dug up the garden once, back in the 40s. Nothing there. Best let the dead alone, miss. I thanked him and left, but as I turned the car round, I saw the upper curtains stir behind the broken glass. A flutter of movement too deliberate for wind. Back at the university, I examined the photograph again under stronger magnification. The metallic sphere in the baby's hand appeared darker than before, almost liquid in its reflection. I scanned it at high resolution. When I enhanced the image, a fine network of lines emerged around the sphere, delicate as veins, extending up the infant's wrist and vanishing beneath the sleeve. At first, I thought it was a trick of exposure, but when I inverted the tones, the pattern glowed faintly, branching outward like circuitry or roots. My stomach turned. I cross-checked with other portraits by the same studio. Nothing similar. Their props were ordinary, toys, flowers, the occasional prayer book. None contained this strange, gleaming object. Out of morbid curiosity, I ran a spectral analysis of the scan. The software interpreted the darkest region, the sphere, as reflective metal of high density, inconsistent with any photographic pigment. I saved the data and shut down the program. The computer froze. Then, for a single second, the monitor brightened. Across the digital image, a narrow crack appeared from the baby's hand to the edge of the frame, not on the print itself, but within the scan. A faint hum filled the speakers, though no audio file was open. I unplugged the system. The hum continued for a heartbeat longer before fading into silence. That evening, Daniel found me still in the dark room, staring at the photograph beneath the safety lamp. "You need sleep," he said gently. "I think there's metal embedded in the emulsion," I murmured, as if something was mixed into the chemicals. "Mercury, perhaps." He raised an eyebrow. "Mercury was common in early development. It doesn't hum, though." I looked at him sharply. "You heard it too?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "I heard something. Maybe a feedback loop." He left soon after. I stayed. When I finally locked the portrait away, I could not resist one last glance. In the half-light, the baby's eyes, which had always appeared closed, seemed minutely parted, the faintest glint visible between the lashes. I began to dream of the child. Always the same image, the infant lying in its mother's arms, eyes sealed, fingers curled around that dark sphere. Each night, as the dream replayed, the angle shifted closer, as though the camera were drawing nearer to the baby's hand. By the third night, the sphere had split along its seam, revealing a hollow interior filled with something that shimmered like quicksilver. The sound that came from it was not a cry, nor a word, but the faint metallic rhythm of something turning. I stopped sleeping after that. Instead, I immersed myself in research, as if facts might inoculate me against whatever shadow had begun to cling to my thoughts. I found that mercury had indeed been used in early photographic toning, though never within the subject of a print. It was lethal, corrosive, and unstable, an element that devoured life even as it preserved images of it. In a local history journal, I uncovered a letter from Arthur Weatherby, dated late 1919, addressed to a chemist named Hollis Avery. The handwriting was precise, lawyerly. Your compound demonstrates remarkable fixative properties. The emulsion remains lucid even after prolonged exposure. I will attempt a practical trial with the next sitting. It may allow her to stay with us longer. The pronoun chilled me. Her. The rest of the letter referred cryptically to infantile strength and transference. I read it again and again, trying to decipher its meaning. The word transference seemed to pulse on the page like a heartbeat. I found Avery's name in an old trade directory, Avery & Sons Photographic Supplies, Derbyshire, defunct since 1922. The archives yielded nothing else, but I had seen enough to understand that Arthur Weatherby had been experimenting, not merely photographing his child. He had tried to capture her, not just her likeness, but her presence. Weeks passed. My colleagues began avoiding me, their smiles a little too careful. I overheard Daniel whispering that I looked pale, not right. I wanted to tell him it was the lighting in the dark room, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid to look at myself in mirrors. Whenever I did, for a heartbeat too long, the reflection behind me seemed to blur, as though a curtain had swayed in a wind that wasn't there. One evening, as I was closing up, the security light in the corridor flickered. I turned the corner and froze. Someone stood in the restoration room. The door was ajar. A faint silver glow spilled through the crack. I pushed the door open. The light was coming from the photograph. It lay on the table exactly where I'd left it, yet its surface shimmered faintly, as if something moved beneath the emulsion. My rational mind offered explanations: chemical reaction, moisture, phosphorescence. But my body understood otherwise. When I bent closer, the baby's eyes were open. They were dark and unfathomable, and in their center reflected not the camera, but a room, my room, with a figure standing where I stood. I dropped the glassine sheet. The light snapped out. For a long time, I stood in the dark, listening to my breath until it steadied. Then, very slowly, I turned the print face down and left the building. I told myself I would not return, but obsession has a gravity of its own. The next morning, I was back, driven by the cold logic of inquiry. I sealed the photograph in a lead-lined envelope and requested permission to send it for spectral imaging at the university's materials lab. The technician, a kind woman named Dr. Malik, raised her brows when she saw the print. "This is beautiful," she said, "but you're right. The surface chemistry looks off." We ran the scan together. The machine hummed, its beam passing over the image in fine increments. The screen filled with the portrait's ghostly contours: father, mother, child, until it reached the baby's hand. Then the monitor glitched, flashing white before stabilizing. "There," Malik said. "That's unusual." Beneath the surface of the print, hidden within the layers of silver nitrate, was another form, a circular cavity surrounded by branching filaments, faintly metallic. She rotated the model on screen. The sphere wasn't solid, it was hollow, and inside it was something that pulsed with reflected light. Could it be part of the emulsion? I asked. She frowned. Emulsion doesn't have a heartbeat. The data registered rhythmic fluctuations every 6 seconds, like a faint electrical pulse. We exchanged glances. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Malik said quietly, "I think we should stop." I nodded, but I didn't. After she left, I copied the scan files onto a portable drive. That night, at home, I opened them again on my laptop. Alone, the images seemed to throb faintly with color. I zoomed in closer and closer until the pixels dissolved into abstract pattern. Beneath the surface grain, faint letters appeared, etched as though by hand. "It remembers." I shut the laptop so hard the lid cracked. I spent the following week researching the Weatherby house again. A surviving neighbor, now in her 90s, recalled that Eleanor Weatherby had the look of a woman who'd seen something she couldn't unsee. She remembered the husband too. A clever man, but not right in the head after the war. When I showed her a reproduction of the portrait, she paled. "I remember that day," she said softly. "He brought the baby out after, all wrapped up. Said she'd fallen asleep." She hesitated, eyes clouding. But it was the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself. I never saw her again after that. I returned to the lab one last time. The portrait waited for me, face down under its cover glass. I told myself I was going to reseal it for long-term storage, nothing more. But when I lifted the glass, the faint hum returned, a vibration low enough to feel in my bones. The baby's eyes were open again. This time, she was not looking at me. She was looking past me. The light in the room dimmed, though the bulbs did not flicker. A shadow gathered at the edge of the table, darkening the air like smoke without source. The curtain in the photograph seemed to ripple, and from its folds something metallic glinted. The sphere, now split clean in two. From within it, a thin thread of silver unfurled, trembling like a strand of mercury, and reached toward the surface of the print. I stumbled back. The thread touched the edge of the photograph, and the air filled with a sound I can only describe as breathing through metal. Then came the whisper, soft, almost tender. She wanted to stay. The voice was not mine. I ran. I don't remember leaving the building, only the sensation of cold air hitting my face as I burst into the rain. I drove home in silence, my hands trembling on the wheel. That night, every reflective surface in my flat seemed alive. The mirrors clouded with condensation. The framed photographs on my walls developed faint, silvery stains, fingerprints that were not mine. And when I woke just before dawn, the smell of developing fluid lingered in the air. I resigned from the university the next month. The portrait was transferred to a secure facility in London under the classification hazardous material, photochemical unknown. Dr. Malik refused further comment. Daniel would not speak to me at all. But before I left, I checked the lab logs one final time. The spectral scanner had recorded a last automatic capture before the shutdown, a frame taken at 23:07, hours after I fled. The image showed the portrait illuminated by its own light. The baby's eyes were fully open now, reflecting not the studio, but the lab itself. In her tiny upturned hand, the metallic sphere had uncoiled completely. It was not a ball. It was a small, perfect coil of wire, the same kind used in early magnetic recording devices. Around it, etched faintly into the print's emulsion, were concentric rings like grooves on a phonograph. I realized then that Arthur Weatherby's experiment had succeeded. He had not only captured his child's likeness, he had captured her breath, and she was still breathing. I keep no photographs in my home now. I have drawn the curtains and covered the mirrors. Yet sometimes, when the light slants through the window at a certain hour, I see a reflection glimmer faintly on the glass, not of myself, but of a woman seated with a child in her arms, smiling with terrible serenity. And in the crook of that child's hand, something gleams. Small, dark and alive, pulsing like a heart beneath mercury light. When the wind stirs, I hear it whisper through the drapes. She wanted to stay. I whisper back, without knowing why. You did. And for an instant, just before the light fades, I think I see the infant blink,